Let's focus now on general justice. So Aristotle identifies general justice with the lawful. That's his. It's because we talk about just people as being lawful that he singles out general justice as a kind of justice. We're going to return to that at the end of this video. We're not going to talk about that right now. We're not really in position to see why he would call it lawfulness. So just put that to the side for now. He thinks of general justice, his view of general justice is that it is complete virtue or virtue entire as it relates to others. Now, if you recall what he thinks about justice, right, the thing up at the top of the tree that then breaks down into general justice and particular justice, he thinks of justice as simply being like our, it's something about how we relate to others. Well, general justice is concerned with kind of every aspect of our character. It's complete, our complete character, complete virtue, because our character is supposed to be virtuous. And if our character is not virtuous, well, then we're not going to be acting just in this general sense, right? So to act just in this general sense, it's going to be any virtue that you act upon, but considering that virtue in terms of how it affects other people as it relates to others. Complete virtue, all of the virtues, but considered in respect of how they affect others. So if you recall in Book 2, Chapter 7, Aristotle gives us a big long list of the virtues. And I have it there for you. Courage, temperance, generosity, etc. And so what he's saying about general justice is that it's really just, courage, temperance, generosity, magnificence, and so on, as they relate to others. Not considered necessarily in their own right, but considered as they relate to others. So let's look at an example to see what exactly he means. So here we have an illustration of temperance or moderation, right? So temperance is the virtue that governs pleasures of touch, as Aristotle puts them. That's the way he puts it. Pleasures of touch include food, drink, and sex, the pleasures of food, drink, and sex. And so temperance is the virtue that's supposed to govern that kind of activity, the pursuit of those kinds of pleasures. Right, and so one kind of pleasure of touch would be drinking alcohol, drinking wine there. We are supposed to drink temperately. Now, according to Aristotle, that doesn't mean total abstinence from food, drink, and sex or whatever, right? Yeah, obviously, you can totally abstain from food, but he wouldn't say don't drink wine at all. His idea would be, no, fine, drink wine, go to the party or dinner party. Yeah, fine, have a glass or two or whatever. But you don't want to drink, the whole bottle or whatever. That's no good. That would be self-indulgent, according to Aristotle. And he's probably right about that. It's probably not a good idea to drink a whole bottle of wine at a party. But, live and learn. And so here we have a guy refusing, say, I don't know, the third, fourth glass, whatever would be self-indulgent, right? He's saying, no, thank you. Now, we might examine his temperance. So he's exhibiting temperance there, right? That's what that's an illustration of. He's exhibiting temperance. Now, we could look at his own inner psychology. What's motivating him? His character, how his character works, how he's disposed, right? What his desires or motivations are. We might look at that kind of thing when examining this action, this behavior. And if we did that, we'd be considering his behavior as temperance. We'd be looking at temperance. We might also, however, and this is going to be different, not examine his inner psychology, not focus on that, on what's motivating him, on his character. We might instead consider how his behavior affects other people, how it relates to others. And when we do that, when we focus on how his behavior affects other people, what we'd be kind of classifying his behavior as is just in the general sense. That's Aristotle's idea. So his temperate action, his temperate behavior can be looked at from two angles. And if we look at it from the one angle, considering his own his inner psychology, well, that's looking at it as temperance. But if we look at it from the perspective of how it affects the other people at the dinner party or wherever he is, right, at the party or wherever, well, then we're considering it as a kind of general justice. It's an expression of justice in this general sense. And presumably the idea would be here, Aristotle doesn't spell out these details, but we could talk about how this behavior, this temperate behavior, it leaves enough for other people, right? He refuses that glass of wine. Somebody else can now have their first glass. It makes the party in general more enjoyable because I don't know if you've ever been at a party where someone's, drank a whole bottle of wine, but they're usually, you usually kind of wish they weren't there, but, not to be too mean about it, but, they can kind of drag a party down or whatever, right? And so, okay, fine. And so his behavior, his temperate behavior, affects others in these positive ways. And when you consider it under that aspect, it's a kind of justice. It's a kind of general justice. And we could tell similar stories for all of the virtues, right? All of the expressions of these virtues can be looked at in these two ways. You can look at it kind of in its own right by focusing on the person's inner psychology. In that case, you're considering the behavior as an expression of courage or temperance or generosity or whatever the behavior is. Or you might look at that behavior and how it relates to or affects other people in the community more generally. And then you'd be considering that behavior as a kind of just behavior or just in this general sense of justice. Okay, so that's the main idea behind general justice. And so any of the virtues in their relations to others can be described as a kind of justice. And so the completely virtuous person, Aristotle is going to say, is we could describe as a completely just person because all of their behavior is going to relate to others in the appropriate way. Something like that is the idea. And so general justice refers to kind of virtue entire, to complete virtue, but as it relates to others. Okay, focusing on it through that lens. Why lawful? What on earth? I mean, if anything, this just makes things more confusing. Why does he call this lawful? Because it's not as though we're going to have a law that says you can't have 3 glasses of wine at a party or whatever, right? 2 is the limit, and you have that third, and we're going to send in the party police, and they're going to, whatever, take you to jail. 2 things. First, by lawful, think of it this way. For Aristotle, and this was true for Greek thinkers in general, Aristotle's not unique in this, but for Aristotle and for Greek thinkers in general, the law was concerned with all of the virtues. The point of the law was to make people virtuous. That's what law did. That was its whole point and purpose. You would have laws prohibiting this behavior, requiring this behavior and whatever, and leaving this behavior up to you, with the purpose of making the citizens more virtuous. And so the connection that Aristotle is relying on here, this connection between virtue and the law, is not at all strange. It would have been entirely expected by his audience. That's the first thing I want to say. So it's not at all weird for Aristotle to draw this very close connection between law and virtue because they had a kind of more expansive, a different view of law. We tend not to think of law like that. We don't think of law as educating citizens into virtue, forming the characters of citizens. That's exactly how they thought of it, though. And we'll actually have occasion to talk about this later when we start talking about the political community. Second thing that I want to mention, you might think now, well, geez, I'm glad I didn't live back then. They would have had all these crazy laws, like saying you can't drink 3 glasses of wine at a party, and I would have gone to jail like every Saturday had they whatever, right? Well, no, that's not quite how it worked either. They had, in addition to thinking that law kind of having a more expansive view of law in the sense that it was supposed to educate citizens into virtue. It wasn't just supposed to protect them from infringements on their liberty or something like that. They also would treat as laws customs. And so Aristotle, Plato, all these Greek thinkers, they all thought there were unwritten laws. And the unwritten laws are perhaps even more important than the ones you write down. And the unwritten laws would be things like, these general kind of guidelines that you learn just by living in a society about how to act, what's appropriate and what's inappropriate. Things that aren't necessarily written down, but kind of societal customs that govern and dictate our behavior. Those would be considered laws too. And in that sense of law, we also have laws about whatever, drinking at parties, right? It is a custom or a societal custom. Yeah, you don't show up at a party and just gulp down all the dip or whatever, right? There's no law. You're not going to jail for that or anything like that. But that's like inappropriate. You don't do that. First, you got to leave some for other people, but in the first place. But then second of all, that's really gross. Why would you just eat all the dip? Law in that sense, right? That's the idea that Aristotle has here. And so he would say, yeah, sure, fine. There's a law, there's a societal custom against excessive drinking in this way. That's general justice.